In a quiet neighborhood, on the edge of a bustling city, lived a man named Yusuf, a clockmaker. In his early 50s, known among his neighbors for his patience and precision, he lived alone in a modest home. Behind his small shop, where he spent long hours repairing old watches and wall clocks, many of which had long lost their place in a world ruled by screens and digital time. His fingers were thick and calloused, yet he moved with such gentleness that he could manipulate the smallest gears without even scratching their surface. Yusuf's life was one of routine and solitude. A boy no older than 12 stepped in hesitantly. He wore a school uniform that was slightly too large and held in his hand a small, battered wristwatch with a cracked face. The casing was scratched and the leather strap frayed, but he could see that it had once been a fine timepiece. He asked Biliel to leave it with him and come back the next week. The boy hesitated, then nodded and left with a polite "thank you," his name, he said. Biliel and the watch had belonged to his grandfather, who had died the previous year. The spring was broken, the gears worn, and the crystal had to be replaced. But he did not mind something in the boy's quiet sincerity. Reminded him of his own daughter, of the way she used to treasure small, simple things. So he worked into the night, cleaning and repairing, not out of duty, but from a quiet urge he had not felt in years. For the first time in years, he felt a silence between each tick. Not as emptiness, but as peace. The grief had not disappeared, but it no longer ruled him. Something new had entered the room, as quiet and persistent as time itself. It was the beginning of something, though he did not yet know what. It no longer ticked, but it was the only thing Biliel had left of him. Each morning began with a cup of black tea, followed by prayer, then a slow walk to unlock his shop. But a single tragedy had broken his life in two as cleanly and cruelly as a sword splits a page. His wife and only daughter had died in a car accident while returning from visiting her grandmother in the countryside. Yusuf had been waiting for them to arrive when the phone rang and delivered the news that ended his former life. The imam spoke not of judgment or fear, but of mercy, of how the smallest acts done sincerely are recorded in the unseen, how patience is not weakness, but endurance and faith. Yusuf felt something stir inside him, not a dramatic change, but a soft shift, as if a gear inside him had moved after being stuck for a long time. He offered to pay, producing a small envelope of coins, but Yusuf shook his head. When Bilal protested, Yusuf smiled and said that the real reward had already been received. From that day forward, he resigned from his position, withdrew from his social circles, and eventually found solace in the quiet company of clocks. His walls were lined with clocks of every shape and sound, or saw a mother hold her daughter's hand. But a weight lived in his chest, dull and persistent, like a stone that had become part of his breathing. He found comfort and structure in the exactness of springs and cogs and the quiet discipline of repair. Each clock he mended felt like a tribute to the time he had lost. At noon he would close for a short rest, and open again until the last rays of sunlight disappeared from the dusty windows. He never advertised his services yet. People came. Old men brought wristwatches from their youth, young couples brought inherited antiques. Even children with broken plastic timepieces came knocking. Yusuf never turned anyone away, no matter how trivial or hopeless to repair. What most did not know was that Yusuf had once been a university professor decades earlier. He taught philosophy, spoke at conferences, and published in journals. Time passed and the grief settled like sediment at the bottom of a deep lake. Yusuf no longer cried when he heard a child laugh. One Thursday afternoon, as Yusuf was finishing the repair of an ornate Turkish mantel clock, the door to his shop creaked open. Yusuf took the watch, gently turning it over in his hand. As Yusuf opened the back of the watch that evening, he discovered that it required a complete overhaul. That weekend, Yusuf decided to attend the Friday prayer for the first time in many months. He sat in the back, listening without expectation. On Monday, Bilal returned when Yusuf handed him the restored watch. The boy's eyes lit up, and he held it close to his chest. After the boy left, Yusuf returned to his bench and looked at the ticking clocks around him. He still walked to the window and opened it. The air smelled of bread and dust and sun. Yusuf breathed in deeply, then sat down again, picked up the next broken watch, and began to work. 2 weeks after Bilal's visit, Yusuf began to notice subtle changes in the rhythm of his life. They weren't loud or disruptive, but gentle as shifting shadows at sunset. Customers came and went, as usual, yet their stories began to linger in his thoughts longer than before. He began to ask questions not just about the broken items they brought, but about their lives. She introduced herself as Samira and explained that she had found her father's old pocket watch among a box of things he had left behind. Her voice cracked slightly as she spoke. Yusuf recognized that kind of grief. Not fresh, but unfinished. She placed the piece on the counter and asked if it could be repaired. And for reasons they could not explain, Manny answered him with honesty, as though the quiet space of his shop gave them permission to be real. The internal parts were rusted from years of neglect, and it would take days to clean and restore. He told her it could be done. They may not reward you with applause or even understanding, but they are necessary for a soul to remain whole. It was Bill Elegant this time, with his older brother Kareem, a tall teenager with tired eyes and calloused hands. Kareem explained that their mother worked 2 jobs, and their father was serving a sentence in prison. Bilal had spoken often of Yusuf and the kindness he showed, and so Kareem had brought with him a broken kitchen clock that once hung in their parents' old apartment. He didn't expect it to be fixable, but hoped it could at least be cleaned. Her face soft with gratitude. But instead of leaving, she lingered. Yusuf offered her a seat, and without prompting, she began to speak. One afternoon, a woman in her late 30s entered the shop with a look of quiet urgency. She stared at it for a long moment, then thanked him quietly. Not out of obligation, but from a need he could no longer ignore. But also trust, guidance, dignity, things that cannot be measured in hours or minutes. His fingers, still stained with oil and dust, rested gently on the sleeve of his coat. He knew now that he had not retired from life. He had simply paused, and the pause was ending. This time, the sermon was about accountability, not just before others, but before oneself. It reminded him of the quiet strength in the choices Samira had made, the resilience in Kareem's tired eyes, the innocence in Bilal's faith. Before leaving, she asked if he knew anyone looking to hire someone with her background. Yusuf paused, then mentioned a friend from his university days, who now worked for an organization focused on ethical finance. They were small, but growing, and might welcome someone with her values. As Kareem described the clock's ticking sound that used to echo through their home, when their father still lived with them, his voice grew quiet. Yusuf did not need to ask much. He had seen these eyes before, boys trying to be men before their time. He promised to restore the clock if possible, and asked only one thing in return: that Kareem return the next week to pick it up with Bilal again, and that they come together. It was as if the cracks in his once-closed world were letting in light. The sorrow that once pressed against his chest had become a quiet companion, not a master. And through each person who entered his door, he saw not just broken timepieces, but broken moments in human lives, all seeking to be restored. Even if only partially, she had been in charge of reviewing contracts, and when a large deal arrived that would have required her to overlook a series of unethical clauses, she refused to approve it. Her rent was overdue, job prospects were scarce, and her younger brother, who depended on her after their parents passed away, was beginning to lose faith in her ability to hold their world together. He did not offer solutions, only his presence. When she left, he began the repair, just with technical care, but with a strange sense of shared dignity. Her struggle mirrored one he had buried 4 years, the battle between survival and principle. He remembered the day he had refused a government grant for a research project, because it was funded by an entity that profited from injustice. His colleagues had mocked him, said he would ruin his future, and perhaps he had, but he never regretted it. Her manager pressured her, hinted at consequences, reminded her of her financial responsibilities. But she stood firm. Within a week, she was dismissed officially due to organizational restructuring. Yusuf examined it carefully. The silver frame was intact. Though tarnished, Samira had recently lost her job after refusing to compromise her values at the company where she worked. She did not regret her decision, she said, but the consequences had left her uncertain. Yusuf listened in silence that evening as he adjusted the balance spring inside Samira's pocket watch. He realized that moral decisions often leave behind scars invisible to others. The next morning, Yusuf received an unexpected visitor. Yusuf took the clock, and invited them to sit. Later that week, Samira returned to collect the pocket watch Yusuf handed it to her. Polished and ticking, she left with hope in her step. For Yusuf, that week became something more than a collection of repairs. The following Friday, he returned again to the mosque. And in that moment, Yusuf realized that the ticking clocks around him were not reminders of what he had lost, but echoes of what he could still give. Time, yes. As the sun set behind the minaret, Yusuf stood outside the mosque watching shadows stretch across the pavement. His fingers, still stained with oil and dust, rested gently on the sleeve of his coat. He knew now that he had not retired from life. He had simply paused, and the pause was ending. Certainly here is the final chapter, chapter 3. The things that remained, the season began to shift. The air grew lighter, and the trees in the neighborhood softened in color. Yusuf noticed the change, not with the indifference of someone who no longer cared, but with a growing attentiveness, as if his senses were beginning to wake from a long slumber. The days still moved quietly, but something within them had shifted. The shop no longer felt like a retreat from the world, but a door slightly open to it. One morning, as Yusuf prepared to open the shutters, he found a folded note slipped under the door. It was written in careful slanted handwriting. "Dear Mr. Yusuf, I wanted to thank you for repairing the clock." It was a small gesture, but it settled in his chest like warmth in winter. He had always believed that actions mattered more than words. But some words, when written from sincerity, could linger like fragrance long after the person had left. There was a boy kicking a ball with his younger sister in the field, but only on one condition: that part of the earnings go toward training young people in the art of repair. One of them was Ahmed, a 17-year-old boy whose hands were clumsy but curious. He had failed in school more than once, but his interest in fixing things was genuine. Yusuf saw in him a spark that reminded him of himself as a young man, eager to understand the world not through words, but through action. So he took him in not as an assistant, but as a student. Not just the technical craft, but the discipline, the patience, the ethics behind it. Henny agreed, a little surprised, but respectful. The girl fell, and the boy helped her up, brushing the dust from her sleeve. Yusuf smiled loss. Never truly left, he thought. But neither did love. It reminded him that we leave traces behind even when we are unaware. The Imam spoke of trust, not only the trust others place in us, but the trust we are given through life itself, in every decision, every opportunity to choose right over wrong. Not a return to the past, not an escape from sorrow, but the beginning of a new season born from the soil of the old one. A word spoken in kindness, a decision made with integrity, a piece of work done with sincerity. These things remain even when we don't see their effect. The clocks in his shop were ticking in harmony outside the city, hummed with life, and in the silence between each tick, Yusuf heard not just time passing, but meaning unfolding. Both became part of a person woven into the way he speaks, listens, chooses. The woman's father had been one of his early clients. That clock had survived all those years passed through time and memory, and now returned to him. Through the hands of the next generation, he simply watched, corrected, guided slowly. Ahmed began to improve. He arrived early, stayed late, and started asking better questions. He even brought in his younger cousin one day to observe. The shop was no longer silent. It echoed with energy, with cautious laughter, with the sound of a new generation learning through their hands. "My brother says Hay's sleeping better. Since we brought it home quite fit," in a look of anxious pride, he introduced himself as Henny, the owner of a local electronics repair store. He had heard of Yusuf through a customer and wanted to propose a partnership. Yusuf could handle the antique pieces. His team lacked the skills or patience. To restore the work was modest, but consistent. Hani promised he would respect Yusuf's terms and pace. She explained that she had found an old wall clock while cleaning out her late father's home. She wasn't sure it worked, but she hoped to preserve it. "Maybe it's not the sound, maybe it's the memory. Either way, I think you gave him more than a fixed clock." That evening, he walked farther than usual, past streets he had not visited in years. As he passed the park where he used to take his daughter, he paused by the swings. They were empty, swaying slightly in the breeze. He remembered the sound of her laughter, the way she once ran to him, with scraped knees and a proud smile. The ache in his heart returned, not sharp, but deep. "You gave him something that feels like home. May Allah bless you." Yusuf read the note twice, then placed it gently inside a small wooden drawer beneath his workbench later. That same day, a man arrived, wearing a suit that didn't. Yusuf asked for time to think. He sat on a nearby bench and watched the sky turn gold by the time he returned home. His decision was clear. He would accept Hanasal for the weeks that followed, brought new faces to Yusuf's shop at first. Ahmed made many mistakes. He stripped screws, cracked glass, mixed up parts. Yusuf never raised his voice. One afternoon as Yusuf was preparing to close, a woman entered. Her face was unfamiliar, but her eyes held the quiet sadness of someone who had walked through loss. When Yusuf opened the back panel, he froze. He recognized the signature on the inner plate. It was his own, etched decades ago, when he had built clocks as a side project during his early university years. He repaired it with extra care, not out of pride, but gratitude. On the final Friday of that month, Yusuf stood in the prayer row beside Ahmed and Kareem, who had also started attending regularly. Billo sat between them, holding his brother's hand. When the prayer ended, Yusuf looked at the boys and felt something he had not felt in many years: continuity. He walked home slowly that evening. He no longer feared the emptiness. He had learned that time, when filled with sincere action, with quiet courage, with trust in what is right, becomes more than seconds and hours. It becomes legacy, and some legacies, even when carved in silence, never stop ticking.